The cold came from all directions. It sliced in from the Antarctic, across 8,000 miles of heaving, hostile ocean. It seeped up from the sodden, frozen ground of the islands themselves, and it emanated from the hearts of men in distant capitals, calculating the value of blood and rock. In April of 1982, the world's last empire was struck not at heart, but at its farthest, most forgotten extremity. A military junta in Buenos Aires, trembling on the brink of collapse, sought salvation in a grand nationalist gamble. Their target, a handful of wind-scoured islands in the South Atlantic, populated by sheep and 2,000 British souls. The Falklands, Las Malvinas, a name that meant nothing and everything. The invasion was a shabby, almost casual affair. Young Argentine conscripts, bewildered and seasick, stumbled ashore to be greeted not by defiant redcoats, but by a lone, unarmed Royal Marine policeman. The world blinked, shrugged. A colonial relic, seized by a second-rate power. A footnote. But in the frozen corridors of Whitehall, a different kind of cold was settling, a deep glacial fury. The Argentine generals had made a fatal, arrogant miscalculation. They believed the distance was too great, the will too atrophied, the empire too dead to fight. They did not understand that for Britain, humiliated by Suez, adrift in economic decay, this was no longer about territory. It was about identity. It was a fire that had to be lit, even if the fuel was to be the last of its youth. The Prime Minister, an Iron Lady forged in a different time, saw not a crisis, but crucible. A task force was assembled not with the confidence of a global power, but with the desperate, cobbled-together determination of a last stand. Merchant ships became troop carriers. Ocean liners were painted gray. It was a flotilla of ghosts, sailing toward the storm at the end of the world. The voyage south was a passage into a primal, punishing reality. The comforts of the North Atlantic fell away, replaced by the screaming 50s, latitudes of perpetual gale. Ships pitched and groaned, men wretched in cramped, airless holds, their world reduced to the smell of diesel, sweat, and fear. They trained with frantic intensity, knowing their enemy had months to dig in, to wait. They were an expeditionary force from a temperate land, sailing into the teeth of an Antarctic winter, to fight for islands that were less a territory and more a state of mind. Barren, treeless, a landscape of peat bogs, razor-sharp stone runs, and a wind that could flay skin. Meanwhile, in Port Stanley, the Argentine occupation curdled. The initial euphoria of the conscripts faded as a cold bit. Supplies grew thin, and the reality of their isolation set in. They were an army of teenagers, led by often indifferent officers, defending a cause many barely understood on soil that hated them. They dug trenches into frozen peat, strung wires, planted tens of thousands of mines. They looked out from their hills, not at an enemy, but at an empty, gray sea, waiting for the storm they now knew was coming. The British, they were told, would not come, could not come. The sea and the sky would swallow them. The first contact was not with soldiers, but with ghosts. Before the main fleet arrived, the shadows were already there. Men of the Special Air Service and the Special Boat Service were inserted onto the islands, becoming one with the freezing bog and rock. They were the eyes in the absolute dark, watching Argentine movements, assessing morale, marking gun positions. Their war was one of silence, of unbearable cold, of existing for weeks in a state of suspended animation, where a cough or the glint of a lens could mean death. They reported back a picture of an enemy that was numerous, dug in but brittle. The will of the conscript was a fragile thing, but the terrain was a formidable ally. The British plan, conceived 8,000 miles away in map rooms, was a brutal simplicity. Secure a beachhead, then yamp. A Royal Marine term for a loaded march through hell, across the entire island of East Falkland to the gates of the capital, Stanley. It was a plan that ignored the weather, the ground, the sheer physical impossibility. Because no other plan existed, there were not enough helicopters. The ships were vulnerable. Time, that most merciless of enemies, was bleeding away with every passing day, as diplomats wavered and international support threatened to crumble. The landing at San Carlos Water, dubbed Bomb Alley by the men who endured it, was a scene of chaotic, sacrificial violence. The British ships were exposed, sitting ducks in confined inlet as the sky tore open with a scream of Argentine daggers and skyhawks. They came in low, skimming the waves, pilots displaying a bravery that bordered on the suicidal. The air filled with a sickening crump of explosions, the rattle of anti-aircraft guns, and the black smoke of burning ships. HMS Antelope, mortally wounded, her bomb disposal expert killed in a final, failed attempt to defuse a 1,000-pound curse in her belly, broke her back, and sank in a fountain of flame. The troops ashore could only watch, digging their shallow scrapes into the peat, feeling a profound and helpless vulnerability. They were on the ground, but the sea that had brought them was dying around them. The war's first great lesson was written in fire on the water. There would be no safe place. From the beachhead, the advance began. It was not a march. It was an ordeal. The Paras and the Royal Marines shouldered loads upward 100 pounds, weapons, ammunition, radio supplies, and stepped into a world of soft, sucking peat that swallowed boots to the ankle and jagged stone runs that lacerated them. The weather was a psychopathic adversary. Brilliant, freezing sunshine 1 hour, then horizontal sleet that felt like needles the next. The wind never ceased its moan. Men drank from peat bogs and were crippled by dysentery. Trench foot, a misery of the First World War, returned. Hypothermia stalked the centuries. They moved at glacial pace. Each step of victory will over physics, while the political clock in London ticked down with a deafening urgency. Commanders in the field, feeling the fragility of their exhausted men, pleaded for time. The signals from Northwood, the military headquarters, were uncompromising. Asterisk advance. Now, asterisk the political need for a victory, any victory, was becoming a tactical imperative that overrode human endurance. The distant war cabinet, staring at opinion polls and diplomatic cables, was now fighting a war on two fronts, one against Argentina and one against perception of British weakness. The first major land battle at Goose Green was supposed to be a limited action to secure a flank. It became a brutal, costly lesson in the fog of war. The 2nd Battalion, Parachute Regiment, attacked at night, expecting a demoralized enemy. They found instead a tenacious defense, fortified in a strung-out settlement, with heavy machine guns and mortars. The battle descended into close quarters nightmare in the dark. Sections were pinned down. A company commander, realizing a frontal assault was suicide, stood up in full view of Argentine positions to direct fire and was cut down. His men, enraged, charged. The fighting was house to house, trench to trench, a brutal scrap of bayonets and grenades in the utter blackness. By dawn, the Paras had won, taking over 1,000 prisoners. But the cost was seared into the battalion's soul. Their commanding officer and 17 others dead, a staggering toll for a single unit in a single night. The myth of a quick, clinical war died in the mud of Goose Green. The Argentine conscript, when cornered, when led with even minimal competence, would fight, and he would kill. The disaster at Bluff Cove was the war's moment of pure, avoidable horror. Pressed by the relentless political timetable, a brigade of guardsmen, men more accustomed to the ceremonial pavement of London than the blasted heaths of the Falklands, were rushed forward by sea in a risky daylight movement. The ship RFA Sir Galahad, packed with young Welsh guardsmen, sat exposed in the inlet for hours, a fat, static target. Argentine observers on the high ground saw everything. When the Skyhawks came, there was no surprise, only inevitability. The bomb struck home, and Sir Galahad became an inferno. Men were incinerated in the enclosed decks, trapped by raging fire. Others, horribly burned, leaped into the freezing, oil-slicked water. The images that escaped the military censors of blackened, suffering men being winched to safety were not of heroic combat, but of a butchers were being presented in the most visceral terms. 48 men died on Sir Galahad and her sister ship. It was a sacrifice born not of tactical necessity, but of haste and political pressure. In the makeshift hospital at Ajax Bay, a field surgery set up in a freezing meat packing plant. Surgeons worked until their arms were coated in blood to the elbow, the floor slick with it, as helicopter after helicopter delivered the charred and shattered results of the day. The war had lost any last pretense of chivalry. Then came the night battles for the mountains, the ring of high ground guarding Stanley. Longdon, Two Sisters Harriet, had to be taken. This was the anvil upon which the campaign would be forged or broken. The attacks went in under the cover of darkness and a howling gale. On Mount Longdon, the 3rd Battalion, Parachute Regiment, walked into a labyrinth of rock. The Argentines of the 7th Regiment, dug into natural stone castles, were waiting. The initial surprise was lost when a para stepped on a mine. What followed was a medieval battle fought with modern weapons. A close-quarter melee in a maze of gullies and caves, illuminated by the ghastly strobe of parachute flares and tracer fire. Men fought with knives, entrenching tools, and rifles used as clubs. Positions were cleared by rolling grenades into caves, then storming in with bayonets fixed. Sergeant Ian McKay, seeing his platoon commander shot and his men pinned down, single-handedly charged an enemy machine gun post, silencing it before he was killed. He was awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross, the ultimate price for ultimate courage in a fight that had descended into primal savagery. The Paras took Longdon after a night of hell, but the mountain had cost them dearly in blood and nerve. To the south, the Royal Marines assaulted Two Sisters and Mount Harriet. Here, the battle was one of fire and maneuver, of outflanking marches across minefields in total darkness. On Harriet, a masterful deception saw one company fixing the Argentines with frontal feint, while 2 others crept silently around the entire flank, emerging behind the defenders to unleash a storm of fire and grenades. The Argentine conscripts, suddenly attacked from an impossible direction, broke. They fled not toward Stanley, but into a box canyon, where they were rounded up by the 100. It was a triumph of professionalism over confusion. But even in success, the cost was etched in the faces of Marines. The 1,000-yard stare of men who had pushed themselves and been pushed beyond all reasonable limits. The final act was played out on the twin peaks of Tumbledown and Wireless Ridge. Tumbledown was the fortress, held by the Argentine 5th Marines, the best unit on the islands. The 2nd Battalion, Scots Guards, were given the task of storming it. It was a brutal, slow-motion chess game played across a rock-strewn spine in the pitch black. The guards inched forward, section by section, blasted by heavy machine gun fire and accurate shelling. For hours, the attack stalled, men pinned down, casualties mounting. There was no elegant solution, only the grim calculus of attrition. They brought up anti-tank missiles to blast rock crevices. They called in artillery, the shells screaming in from miles away to pound the Argentine positions. Finally, with a sheer, desperate fury, the guards fixed bayonets and charged the final heights. The fighting was hand-to-hand, a brutal crescendo of grenades and point-blank gunfire. When dawn broke, the Scots Guards held the summit, looking down at the streetlights of Stanley twinkling below. They had wrested the key to the city from the enemy's best, but the ridge was littered with the proof of the price. With Tumbledown fallen, the will of the Argentine High Command shattered. On Wireless Ridge, the Paras unleashed a devastating, overwhelming barrage of shells and machine gun fire. A display of firepower meant not just to kill, but to annihilate the spirit to resist. The Argentine conscripts on the ridge broke and ran, a ragged stream of figures fleeing in panic toward Stanley. The British pursuit was relentless. In Port Stanley, General Menendez, isolated and abandoned by his government in Buenos Aires, faced the inevitable. His young army, which had fought with unexpected tenacity in places and collapsed in others, was spent. The British, exhausted but unbroken, were at the gates. In a somber ceremony in a drafty conference room, the surrender was signed. The war was over. It had lasted 74 days. The silence that followed was almost more profound than the thunder of battle. The task force returned to a hero's welcome, bands playing, flags waving. But the men who stepped off the ships carried a different country back with them in their eyes. They had seen the cost of national pride measured in the burned flesh of friends on the Galahad, in the frozen, contorted bodies on the slopes of Longdon, in the blank surrender in the eyes of the teenage conscripts they had defeated. Britain had reclaimed its islands, and in doing so, had reclaimed a sense of itself. But it was a darker, harder, more complicated self than the one that had sailed south. The war proved little and cost much. It was a colonial echo, a last gust of imperial wind that cleared the air for a moment, but could not stop the changing of the season. The Argentine junta fell, its gamble a catastrophic failure. But in the cold ground of the Falklands, and in the memories of the men who fought there, the war never really ended. It simply froze in time, a stark, brutal monument to the terrible truth that sometimes nations must send their best to the worst places on Earth to fight for things that are measured not in wealth or strategy, but in the fragile, flickering currency of honor. And the bill for that honor is always paid in the young, who are left forever in the wind and the peat and the stone. Title Asher's storm of the century, the Falklands War, where Britain's empire died. YouTube description asterisk. In the brutal winter of 1982, a forgotten war erupted at the bottom of the world. A desperate Argentine dictatorship seizes a windswept British colony, triggering an impossible mission. A task force sailing 8,000 miles into the teeth of an Antarctic storm to take it back. This is not a story of grand strategy, but of raw human endurance. Witness the terror of Bomb Alley, where ships became infernos. Follow young British soldiers as they yomp across a frozen hell of peat bogs, pushed beyond breaking point by politicians counting miles and minutes. Feel the visceral horror of the Bluff Cove disaster, where dozens of men were burned alive in a single, shocking strike. And experience the nightmarish close-quarter combat on mountains like Longdon and Tumbledown, where battles were fought with bayonets in the dark against a tenacious, teenage enemy. This documentary strips away the myth to reveal the Falklands War in all its brutal, haunting reality. Using chilling first-hand accounts and cinematic storytelling, we explore the political gambles, the tactical nightmares, and the profound human cost of a conflict that felt both ancient and terrifyingly modern. It was a war fought at the very edge of logistics, sanity, and the world itself. A last, bloody gasp of empire that forged modern Britain and shattered Argentina. Why did men fight and die for these barren rocks? What does it feel like to be pushed to your absolute limit, physically and mentally, for a cause decided by others thousands of miles away? Subscribe and join us in the comments. Was this a noble last stand or a tragic, avoidable waste? What is the true price of national pride? This is a definitive, unflinching account of the war that changed two nations forever.